The 47th French Grand Prix was held at the fast Reims circuit. It was the 4th Grand Prix of the year. Mossa had driven the race of his life to win at Monaco, but the much more powerful Ferraris had completely dominated the subsequent Dutch and Belgian Grand Prix, von Tripsa winning at Zandvoort and Fil Hil at Spa. Rob Walker's Lotus, entered for Stirling Moss, consisted of last year's Lotus 18, its chassis updated with this year's rear suspension, a 5-speed Colotti gearbox and new bodywork. The Porsches were to be driven by Swede Joe Bonnier, Dan Gurney from California, and the amateur Dutchman Karel de Beaufort. Clark and Ireland were entered in the works Lotuses. The Yeoman Credit team, with manager Reg Parnell and drivers Surtees and Salvadori, had the latest Coopers, one running on SU carburetors instead of the usual Vapors. The grandstands give a good view of the pits and main straight, as well as to the more distant parts of the circuit. John Surtees went out in the training car. Times in T cars were not recognized by the timekeepers. The Ferrari team had entered 4 of its Dino 156s with their distinctive twin nostril air intakes. 3 of the cars had the new 120-degree V6, the 4th the older 60-degree unit. Either way, they had a lot of power in hand over the 4-cylinder Coventry Climax engine. The 3 main team drivers were Fil Hil, Ricci Gintera and Taffy von Tripsa. The 4th car was entered by a group of Italian motor racing clubs to promote young Italian talent, but it was effectively a works car. It was to be driven by the young Italian Giancarlo Baghetti. Baghetti from Milan has only driven in 2 Formula One races before now, and he's won them both, non-championship events at Syracuse and Naples. Unsurprisingly, the Ferraris set the pace on the first day of practice. Moss set a very fast time by slipstreaming von Tripsa. Stirling then came back in, and on his way gave the Ferrari team a Churchillian gesture. He had set a time which would have been impossible without their help. Ferrari team manager Tavoni then pulled Baghetti in to prevent the other Coventry Climax engine cars doing the same thing. This circuit, over public roads near Reims, sweeps across the cornfields for a lap distance of a little over 5 miles. It is extremely fast, with average lap speeds of over 125 miles per hour. When it comes to racing cars, the French really do have a wonderfully laissez-faire attitude to motoring law, and I spotted John Surtees driving his Formula One Cooper through town and out to the circuit. The last practice session was held on Friday evening. It was still scorchingly hot. Rob and Stirling tried to keep out of the sun. At Muison, a Lola Formula Junior car had to be rescued by the marshals before Grand Prix qualifying could begin. Then the Grand Prix cars set out on their final qualifying runs. Von Tripsa was being followed by pupil Baghetti, the Ferrari V6 engines sounding much better than the Coventry Climaxes. Stirling went out, but he was not really trying, as he knew that his artificial slipstream time could not be bettered. All the climax engine cars were trying to follow the Ferraris, but by now this tactic had been rumbled, and the Ferraris would back off or pit to prevent aiding their competition. The BRMs, Coopers and Lotuses were all lapping around the 2 minutes 30 seconds mark. Ferraris were capable of lapping 5 seconds quicker than this. Sunday afternoon was as hot as ever. It was 102 degrees in the pits and over 120 degrees on the circuit. Sterling went out for a last-minute check. And Joe Bonnier did likewise in the ex-Rob Walker Porsche 718. 3 Ferraris occupied the front row of the grid. Baghetti, the new boy, was on the 5th row alongside Bonnier's Porsche and Brooks's BRM. Fil Hill and the slender-framed Ricci Gintera discussed their tactics for the race ahead. Roy Salvadori, having his first Grand Prix of the year, was back on the 6th row, 15th fastest. One French official seemed to be imitating our very own John Bolster. I spotted Tony Brooks talking to Peter Berthen of BRM. It was so hot that the Ferrari mechanics and even certain spectators were trying everything to keep cool. Many cars had body panels removed and slots cut in vital places to improve the air conditioning. BRM had fitted wire mesh stone guards because the heat was likely to break up the track. Most drivers also soaked themselves in water to cool off. They would be sitting in a furnace for the 2¼ hours of the race. The cars were assembled with the 3 Ferraris up front, then Sterling and Jim Clark in the works Lotus. McLaren, Surtees and Graham Hill were on the 3rd row, Innes Ireland and Dan Gurney on the 4th. Of these, McLaren was starting his 21st Grand Prix, Surtees only his 8th, Hill his 28th, Ireland his 17th and Gurney his 15th. Of these, only McLaren had yet been a winner. All 26 starters got away perfectly. New boy Jack Lewis, in only his 2nd Grand Prix, was in trouble immediately. His Cooper Climax was overheating badly. By lap 5, the Ferrari of Fil Hill led, followed by his teammate von Tripsa. Moss was in 3rd, having passed Ginther's Ferrari when the American spun. There was a tremendous battle for 5th between Clark, Ireland, Graham Hill, Baghetti, Bonnier, McLaren and Gurney. Fil Hill oversteered through Muison well ahead of any traffic. Moss was having brake trouble, and the cars scrapping for 4th to 12th place began to overhaul him. Baghetti was having a tough time with Clark, Bonnier, Graham Hill, McLaren and Gurney all around him. Following pit orders, von Tripsa took the lead on lap 13. Then he and Fil Hill were given signals to slow down by team manager Tavoni, allowing Ginther to catch up. On lap 19, Stirling decided that his brakes were just too bad and came into the pit. Al Francis discovered that the balance pipe between the two pads of the right-hand rear disc had fractured. While Moss was in the pits, von Tripsa retired with water pouring out of his right-hand exhaust. The 120-degree engine had not given any trouble in any of its 3 previous Grand Prix. Fil Hill was now back in the lead, with Ginther lying second. Stirling lost 4 laps while his brakes were fixed. Ferrari number 16, driven by Fil Hill, sounded fine, but it seemed to me that the race would be infinitely more interesting if the Ferraris were to strike engine troubles. Poor Stirling came back into the pits after only 1 lap out, complaining of a tremendous vibration. It was found that a large lump of molten tarmac and stones had, on his previous stop, coagulated on one place on the wheel, putting it wildly out of balance. Once this was removed, he went out again, but was now too many laps behind the leaders. Fil Hill was now leading by 10 seconds from Ginther. Baghetti was up to 3rd, but was still being harried by the Lotuses of Clark and Ireland. Behind them came de Beaufort's lapped Porsche, then Bonnier, McLaren, Gurney, Graham Hill, and one of the UDT cars, Salvadori, I think it was. Baghetti found himself sandwiched between the works Lotuses of Clark and Ireland. Stirling was still running, now many laps in arrears. When Ireland's Lotus started losing power and Clark dropped back, the young Baghetti found himself mixing it with the Porsches of Gurney and Bonnier. Poor Baghetti was certainly having a tough baptism in Grand Prix racing. Fil Hill still held a healthy lead over his teammate Ricci Gintera. But on the next lap at Thilois, Phil lost his Ferrari on the molten tar and was promptly hit by Moss. Moss sustained suspension damage and was forced to retire. Hill had stalled his engine. He tried to restart it, forgetting that this had recently been banned by the governing body. Now Ricci Gintera was in the lead. Only 2 Ferraris were left, with a strong Porsche and Lotus challenge not far behind. An unruffled Stirling described the shunt. I came round Thilois, and there he was. I had nowhere to go. The battle for second place was now headed by Joe Bonnier, followed by Baghetti and then Gurney. Ginther was forced to stop at Muison with failing oil pressure, so the hopes of Ferrari and Italy now lay with the debutant Giancarlo Baghetti, who was having a tremendous battle with Gurney and Bonnier. Lap after lap, the Ferrari and the 2 Porsches went by as one. And then, with only 2 laps remaining, poor Joe Bonnier's engine let go. Into the last lap, and Gurney was tucked right up behind Baghetti. Gurney outbraked Baghetti to lead out of Thielwar, but Baghetti dived out of the slipstream with only 300 yards to go and won by less than a car's length. Jimmy Clark was third, Ireland fourth, McLaren fifth, and Graham Hill sixth. Giancarlo Baghetti had become the first driver to win his first Grand Prix. He had done magnificently to hold off much more experienced opposition, led by Dan Gurney, first in for a well-deserved drink. Innes Arden looked exhausted as he brought in his Lotus. Team Lotus, yet to win a Grand Prix for themselves, must have been delighted by this result. To have finished second and third in a race of such attrition shows that they have now found reliability.